Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, Super Mario Galaxy, Super Mario Galaxy 2, Super Mario 3D Land, Super Mario 3D World, and Super Mario Odyssey. Over the years, Nintendo has graced us with amazing 3D Mario games, and will likely continue to do so. In this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the future might entail in regards to 3D Mario. What can we expect for the next 3D Mario game, but even beyond that, what can we expect? Will we see a big shift in how Nintendo approaches 3D Mario, similar to how Breath of the Wild signaled a shift for the 3D side of Zelda games? It's of course possible, but to start, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of 3D Mario games, starting with, of course, the one that started it all, Super Mario 64. This game, of course, as many of you know, is an incredibly fantastic, revolutionary game that was released for the Nintendo 64. Not only that, but it was actually a launch game for the Nintendo 64, so in many ways you could consider this game strongly tied to the Nintendo 64 branding and identity, similar to how Breath of the Wild is strongly tied to the Nintendo Switch's branding and identity. Super Mario 64 is, of course, revolutionary for a number of different reasons, such as being the first, or at least one of the first, 3D platforming games ever made. Not only that, of course, but it also took advantage of a number of Nintendo 64's newest features, like its controller, like its analog stick. Visually, of course, it was a great-looking game for its time as well. But when we look at the core gameplay, when we look at how Super Mario 64 plays, how progression works in the game, the design of the levels, we can see that this game was also revolutionary in regards to how future 3D Mario games would play out. A lot of the 3D Mario games, minus 3D Land and World, actually used roughly the same template that this game laid out. Like the idea of getting a star every level, and how, depending on the episode of the level, the star would be in a different place. Of course, this was slightly different between entries, but nonetheless, the core idea was there. And also, Mario's core movement also was relatively intact between all of these different games. Of course, minus 3D Land and 3D World. But Super Mario 64 is what Nintendo considers a 3D Mario sandbox game. And I think that's the key word here, is sandbox. This is the type of gameplay we see in a Mario game where the game is much less linear and allows the player to roam around freely. We also notice that in these Mario sandbox games, we also have more episodes and more stars to collect per world of the game. Now if we move on to Super Mario Sunshine, this all stays true basically, except for the fact that every episode you click, every episode you start, will have basically a new theme and a new twist on the same level, whereas Super Mario Sunshine, basically no matter what star you pick, the level will remain the same. So Super Mario 64 changed that. But Super Mario Galaxy is when things get really, really interesting, because that game basically, it takes a lot of the same elements that Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine introduced, but takes them in a more linear direction. That's of course when Nintendo started to classify 3D Mario games like Mario Galaxy as linear 3D Mario games. Because when you look at the level design of Super Mario Galaxy, it's very straightforward, very, very little freedom in regards to how the player progresses through the level. It's basically a set path, whereas in Super Mario 64 and Sunshine, you can basically roam around the level wherever you wanted to go, looking for whatever you needed to find, whether it's the star or it's the shine sprite or whatever the case. You could basically go around the entire level and get from one place to another in more than one way. This is simply not the case in most of the levels in the Galaxy games. There are of course some exceptions, but for the most part, the Super Mario Galaxy games are quite linear in terms of its level design and how players progress through the game. Of course, we also have the hub world, which is much smaller, but the individual levels within the game also have much less episodes, or stars in this case. Most of the time you'll encounter 3 stars per level, per world in the game, whereas in Super Mario Sunshine, Super Mario 64, there will be 8 stars, or 8 shine sprites per level. But that being said, Super Mario Galaxy did something that the other two didn't do, and that was the fact that it had much more variety. It had more levels, which means that it made more sense to have less stars per level. so it kind of allowed for a bit more variety. But putting that aside, Super Mario Galaxy and Super Mario Galaxy 2 were linear 3D Mario games where the player basically was put on a set path for most of the levels. Now, Super Mario 3D Land and Super Mario 3D World are actually quite different in this regard. They're also classified as linear 3D Mario games, but they're not too similar to the games that came before them. In other words, they're not too similar to the sandbox nature of Super Mario 64 and Sunshine, and they're also not very similar to the linear nature of Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. They're, for all intents and purposes, very different 3D Mario games, but they also stand out because of that. Of course, Super Mario 3D Land was the very first 3D Mario game built from the ground up for a handheld device, the Nintendo 3DS. And I remember playing through that game and having a blast. It is a fantastic game. And it's actually truly a shame that most people tend to write it off when it comes to listing 3D Mario games or talking about their favorite 3D Mario games. It tends to be the black sheep in many ways, but for me personally, 3D Land is a fantastic game and I've never forgotten my experiences playing it. And of course, Super Mario 3D World basically one-ups that game in basically every way, in my opinion. I think Super Mario 3D World is also such a fantastic game. But nonetheless, they do stand out as being quite different from the other 3D Mario games, including the next one, which is Super Mario Odyssey, which actually returns to the sandbox nature of Super Mario 64 and Sunshine. Nintendo kind of listened to the fans in this regard because I believe fans, especially during the Wii U era and the 3DS era, when Mario 3D Land released and when Mario 3D World released, there was a bit of an uproar because fans wanted to see something along the lines of more ambitious titles like 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy. And so that's why Odyssey was created, basically, so that it could cater back to those fans that wanted to see 3D Mario return to its roots. So we have a 3D Mario game in Mario Odyssey that plays very similarly to the previous 3D Mario games that came before 3D Land. We of course have the episodic nature, we have the collectible stars, or in this case the moons. And when I say episodic nature, I simply mean instead of jumping into a level and coming out of it after getting a star, in this case you actually stay in the level, but each moon has its own theme and has its own challenge and objective associated with it. So it's basically the same idea as the stars. The only difference is, well, in many ways they're actually much more common to get, but also you can stay in the level you're in. You don't have to return to a hub world, which in this case there really isn't one. Of course, Super Mario Odyssey also introduces at times very large open sandbox environments. Like, remember the Sand Kingdom? The Sand Kingdom almost feels like a little taste of an open world Mario, but just because of how big and vast it is. And of course, me saying that, we also have to bring up Bowser's Fury, which is the even bigger sampling of what a 3D Mario game could potentially be. So let's get into that. Let's get into what I think the next 3D Mario game will potentially be. Is it possible that the next 3D Mario game will be an open world game similar to Bowser's Fury? Absolutely, and I think that is the direction that Nintendo is potentially headed in. I think that the next 3D Mario game will be, in many ways, an open world game. Now, when I say in many ways, I don't necessarily mean that we're going to get an open world Mario game like Breath of the Wild, where you can literally go anywhere you want with very minimal loading, aside from going into shrines. I think that the areas in general will be very large, but there will still be some separation between them. I don't think we can just seamlessly go from one area to another, but again, that's just my opinion. But I think that we're going to get what is basically a semi-open world Mario game. It's going to take a lot of the same elements. It's going to take a lot of the elements from previous 3D Mario games, whether it's 64, Sunshine, Galaxy, 3D Land, 3D World, and Odyssey, and basically put them into one. So maybe we'll have Mario exploring one gigantic kingdom, in this case what I feel is most likely the Mushroom Kingdom, but a much more interconnected, much more vibrant and lively Mushroom Kingdom. Of course, that's hard to believe considering the Mushroom Kingdom is already vibrant and lively, but in terms of a gameplay perspective, in terms of seeing it on brand new hardware, and just seeing the Mushroom Kingdom in a completely different light, I think that's what this game is going to offer. Perhaps we may even revisit certain areas we visited in previous Mario games. Maybe Peach's Castle will be somewhere at the center of the kingdom, similar to Hyrule Castle in the Breath of the Wild map, perhaps. Maybe we'll see certain worlds from Super Mario 64 returning. There's a lot of possibility here. But when we talk about gameplay, there's a lot of elements that I feel would potentially carry over from previous Mario games. Like Mario's movement, for example. I think that Mario's movement, particularly the style that we see in Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Odyssey and Sunshine and Galaxy, I think that movement system will return. I think we'll have Mario doing flips and running and doing triple jumps all over again. I think we're going to see all that. But the question is, will this game be more of a sandbox game or a linear game? And of course, it may seem like an easy answer, right? If I'm suggesting that the next 3D Mario game will be open world, then obviously it'll be sandbox, right? And that is true, that is very true, but there is possibility that Nintendo will incorporate linearity in some way. Maybe certain levels will have the player progress from point A to point B in a much more linear way. But the general progression and feel of the game, in my opinion, I think it is going to be leaning more towards player freedom and more of a sandboxy environment where the player can run around as if they're in a playground. And that all sounds very, very fun. So of course I'm looking forward to what Nintendo has to show. But of course, another big question, is this destined to be the future of 3D Mario? When we look at Zelda Breath of the Wild and then Tears of the Kingdom, we can clearly see that there's a certain direction Nintendo wants to take with the 3D Zelda games. There's a very clear, brand new template that they're following, starting with Breath of the Wild. And you could see that carry over in Tears of the Kingdom, not just that they're using the same world, but just the general way the story is told, like through memories and flashbacks essentially, and Link going around the world to find them. It seems like that is a constant. It seems like that is something that Nintendo wants to keep essentially as the template for future Zelda games. And of course, there's a lot of ways they could evolve that. It might not stay the same exactly, and maybe this is the only time where they did do that because Tears of the Kingdom is a direct follow-up to Breath of the Wild, but only time will tell in that regard. In Mario's case, I think it's much less clear-cut simply because we've seen evolutions of the 3D Mario games in the past already. We've seen Super Mario 3D Land and 3D World, and we've seen that they are quite different from the Galaxy games, from Odyssey, from 64 and Sunshine. They're quite different. Do they have similarities? Well, of course, but for the most part, they're designed quite differently. And so it's totally possible that Nintendo may try different things throughout the course of several years and several entries of 3D Mario games. But I think from this point on, we may still end up seeing bigger 3D Mario games by this point. Maybe bigger, more open and vast Mario games. And of course, that is a future that I'm excited to see. But what do you guys think? What do you think is going to be the future for 3D Mario games? Do you think Nintendo will continue in the sandbox direction that Odyssey kind of returned to? Do you think future games will be open world, like this next game that I'm predicting? Or do you think they'll return to something more linear, something smaller? What do you guys think? Let me know, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care, guys. Have a good one, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.